My brother asked, "Why did you stop calling me after the wedding?" So I opened my phone, showed him the messages I had sent that night, and answered, "Because you never replied when I needed you most." The screen lit up between us at 11:40 on a Sunday night, 7 months after the wedding, and I watched my brother's face change in real time as he scrolled through 11 messages he was seeing for the first time in his life. His thumb kept moving up, then stopping, then moving up again, like he thought if he scrolled fast enough the timestamps would rearrange themselves into something less damning. I did not say a word while he read them. I had promised myself months ago that the next time this conversation happened, I would let the evidence do the talking instead of my voice, because my voice always cracked halfway through and gave people an excuse to comfort me instead of hearing me. He got to the 9th message, the one with the photo attached, and his hand actually started to shake. I had been the responsible one for as long as I could remember, the kind of default that gets assigned to a kid before she is old enough to have a say in it. Our mother died of an aneurysm when I was 11, and Silas was 7, fast and without warning, the kind of death that leaves no negotiation period, just a before and an after with nothing connecting them. Our father, Walter, was a good man who loved us both, but grief had hollowed something out of him that never fully grew back. And somewhere in that hollowed-out space, I became the one who packed lunches and signed permission slips and sat up with Silas when he had nightmares about a mother he was already starting to forget the sound of. Nobody assigned me that job. It just landed on me the way water finds the low point in a yard. And I filled it because somebody had to, and I was the one standing closest. Silas grew up soft in a way I never resented until much later. Soft the way a kid gets when somebody has quietly absorbed all the sharp edges of the world on his behalf. I checked his homework. I drove him to baseball practice starting the year I got my license, 4 years before he needed a ride to anything else. I was the one who sat across from his high school guidance counselor when he was failing pre-calc, not our father, who worked long shifts at the plant and came home too tired to parse a transcript. I never thought of any of it as a burden while I was doing it. I thought of it as love, because that is what love looked like in our house after 2006. A series of quiet responsibilities nobody named out loud and everybody depended on. Silas met Vivienne during his 2nd year of grad school, and I liked her immediately, which surprised me, because I had built up a low, simmering suspicion of anyone who might come between me and the only sibling I had left. Vivienne was sharp and funny, and she asked me real questions the first time we met, the kind that made it clear she had actually researched who I was before showing up to dinner. I told myself, watching them together that first year, that I was finally allowed to relax a little, that Silas had built himself a life sturdy enough that I could step back from the scaffolding I had been holding up under him since he was 7 years old. That relief turned out to be premature, though I would not understand exactly how premature until the night of their wedding. But the wedding was in October, at a restored barn venue about 90 minutes from our childhood home, the kind of place with string lights and a cash bar that Vivienne's parents helped cover because Silas and I both knew our father's pension did not stretch that far. I drove Dad up myself that morning because his hands had started shaking on longer highway stretches, a detail he waved off every time I brought it up, insisting it was nothing, just getting older, nothing a man needs a doctor poking around for. He had a heart condition diagnosed 2 years earlier, atrial fibrillation, managed with medication he was inconsistent about taking because he hated how it made him feel foggy in the mornings. I had learned to watch him the way you watch weather, always aware of the pressure even when the sky looks clear. The ceremony was beautiful. Silas cried during his vows, which surprised absolutely no one who had ever seen him watch a dog food commercial, and I cried too, sitting in the 2nd row next to our father, who reached over at one point and squeezed my hand without looking at me, which was as close as he ever got to saying something out loud. The reception moved into the barn as the sun went down, string lights coming on overhead, and I remember feeling, for maybe the first time in years, like I could actually exhale. Like the family I had spent 2 decades holding together with both hands had finally found its own footing without needing me underneath it every second. That feeling lasted almost exactly 3 hours. Around 9:15, I noticed our father had gone quiet at our table, quieter than the noise level should have allowed, sitting very still with one hand pressed flat against his sternum, in a way that looked casual if you were not the person who had spent 2 decades learning his tells. I asked him if he was okay, and he said he was fine, just needed some air, and I told myself it was nothing, that a wedding is loud and hot and full of dancing, and that a 61-year-old man wanting quiet air was not automatically a crisis. I walked him outside anyway, because 20 years of vigilance does not turn off just because you decided to relax for one evening. We got maybe 30 feet from the barn doors before his knees buckled, not dramatically, more like a puppet whose strings had simply been let go all at once, and I caught most of his weight going down, both of us ending up on the gravel of the parking lot with his head against my shoulder, and his breathing gone wrong in a way that made my whole chest go cold. I told myself for one more second that it was nothing, that people faint at weddings from heat and champagne, and then I saw his lips, and they were the wrong color, a grayish blue that does not belong on a living person's face, and the rationalizing part of my brain simply shut off and the emergency part took over completely. I pulled my phone out with hands that were already shaking and called 911 first, because that part of me was still functioning correctly even as everything else went sideways, and the dispatcher, a woman with a calm, flat voice who identified herself as Dispatcher Renee Okonkwo, walked me through checking his pulse and positioning him while I balanced the phone against my shoulder and pressed 2 fingers to his neck and found something thready and irregular that did not feel like a heartbeat so much as a heartbeat's rough draft. While I was on that call, with my father dying or not dying on the gravel underneath me, I texted my brother, because he was 30 feet away inside a building full of 200 people, and because in that moment I still believed, the way you believe things out of pure muscle memory, that if Silas knew, he would come. My first text said Dad collapsed outside, call 911 is on the way, need you now, sent at 9:19 p.m. My second text, 90 seconds later, said seriously, Silas, I need you outside right now, this is not a joke. The dispatcher was still talking me through compressions when I sent the third one at 9:23. Just 3 words, he's not breathing, and I want to be honest that I do not fully remember typing that message because my hands were doing CPR on my own father's chest, while my brain was somewhere very far away, watching the whole scene from a distance, the way people describe it happening in movies, except it is not like a movie, it is worse, because nobody yells cut and nobody stands up laughing afterward. An ambulance arrived at 9:31, 12 minutes after I first called, and 2 paramedics I would later learn were named Deshawn Purefoy and Alicia Renfro took over compressions and got a line in, and shocked him once in the gravel parking lot of a barn wedding venue, while 200 guests slowly noticed something was happening outside and began drifting toward the doors to watch. I stood back with my hands covered in gravel dust and my dress torn at the knee, and I texted Silas a 4th time, please, at 9:33, 1 word, because I did not have anything else left in me to type. He did not come outside. He did not come outside for another 40 minutes, and by the time he did, our father was already in the back of an ambulance heading to St. Aloysius Medical Center, with me climbing in after him, and Silas was standing in the parking lot in his wedding tuxedo, asking a stranger what had happened, because nobody had told him yet, because I had spent 40 minutes assuming every single text I sent had reached him, and he had simply chosen not to come. I found out 3 days later, sitting in a hospital cafeteria with my father stable but weakened in a room upstairs, that Silas's phone had been sitting in a lockbox at the venue's coat check the entire reception, part of an unplugged, phone-free wedding policy that he and Vivian had decided on together months earlier, a detail I had known about in the abstract and completely forgotten in the specific terror of that parking lot. He had not ignored 11 texts. He had never seen them. Nobody had thought to run and get him. The coat check attendant did not know which lockbox belonged to the groom, and by the time anyone figured it out, an ambulance had already come and gone, and the bride's mother was the one who eventually pulled him aside and told him his father had been taken to the hospital, more than half an hour after I had needed him most. I want to be honest about the part that still makes my chest tighten even now, which is that knowing the explanation did not undo the 40 minutes I had spent alone on that gravel, and it did not undo the 11 texts sitting there unanswered while I did chest compressions on my own father's body, and it did not undo the specific, physical loneliness of watching 200 people mill around a parking lot taking video on their phones while my brother, the one person who should have been standing next to me, was somewhere inside dancing to a song I could still name if you asked me, because Vivian's cousin told me later exactly which song had been playing when it happened. I told myself, in the cafeteria, that it was not his fault, that a phone-free wedding was a reasonable choice, that nobody could have predicted this. I told myself that for months. I am not sure I ever fully believed it. Our father survived, though the cardiologist, Dr. Priyanka Vashisht, was very direct with us during the follow-up appointment about what the delay likely cost him. She explained, drawing a rough timeline on a whiteboard in her office, that the interval between onset and defibrillation matters enormously in cases like this, and that every minute without intervention increases the risk of lasting damage to the heart muscle and, in some cases, the brain. She was careful not to assign blame directly. Doctors rarely do that out loud, but she did say, in a sentence I have never fully been able to shake, that earlier access to the AED at the venue could have made a meaningful difference, and that the 12 minutes before EMS arrival were the most critical window they had lost. Our father's ejection fraction, a number I did not understand before that year and now think about more than I would like to admit, came back permanently reduced. He would need medication for the rest of his life that he had previously only sort of needed. He would tire climbing a single flight of stairs in a way he had not before. I went home that night, the night of the follow-up appointment, and I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet. The exact posture I would later learn is apparently a universal position for people absorbing a fact they cannot yet stand up under. And I thought about those 11 unanswered texts sitting in my phone like fossils, evidence of a version of that night where help came and a version where it did not, and how I had lived, for 40 of the worst minutes of my life, entirely inside the second version while believing my own brother had simply chosen not to answer. I did not blame him for the coat check policy. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about a villain who ignored his dying father on purpose. This is a story about what happened after, which is where the actual damage lives. Silas apologized, once, in the hospital hallway the night it happened. A short, stunned apology delivered while he was still in his tuxedo with the bow tie undone and hanging loose around his neck. I accepted it, because what else do you do standing in a hospital hallway at midnight, and because I genuinely believed, in that moment, that the apology was the beginning of something rather than the entirety of it. What I did not expect, what took me completely by surprise over the following months, was how quickly the story in our family reshaped itself into something that made my 40 minutes on that gravel disappear almost entirely, replaced by a narrative in which the real tragedy of the night was that Dad's medical emergency had happened at all, on Silas and Vivian's wedding day, as though the timing had been an imposition committed against them, rather than a medical event that had nearly killed our father while I did compressions on him alone. I noticed the shift first at Thanksgiving, 5 weeks later, when Vivian's mother, a kind woman named Odalise, who I liked and still like, said something at the table about how awful it must have been for Silas, watching from a distance and not knowing what was happening at his own wedding. I sat there with a fork halfway to my mouth and felt something cold move through my stomach, because nobody at that table, including Silas, mentioned what it had been like for me, kneeling on gravel in a torn dress doing compressions with a dispatcher's voice in my ear, texting a phone that would not be answered for 40 minutes. I told myself it was nothing, that Odalise simply did not know the details, that grief makes people center whoever is closest to their own heart, and that I was being petty comparing my 40 minutes to his 40 minutes of not knowing. The second time it happened was at Christmas, when our father, recovering well but visibly slower than before, told the story of that night to a cousin who had not heard it yet, and in his retelling, the emphasis fell entirely on how frightening it must have been for Silas to find out mid-reception, how hard it must have been for him to leave his own wedding and rush to the hospital, how strong Silas had been holding it together for Vivian's sake that night. My father did not lie. Every detail he said was technically true, but I sat there listening to an entire account of the worst night of my life, in which I appeared only as a supporting character, the sister who happened to be there, rather than the person who had physically kept our father alive on a gravel parking lot with her own 2 hands, while everyone else was inside dancing. I told myself again that it was nothing. The third time I talked myself out of a feeling that was actually trying to tell me something true, because that has always been my particular skill, absorbing things quietly and calling it strength instead of what it actually was, which was training. 20 years of training in making myself smaller so the people around me could take up the space they needed. I did not say anything to my father. I did not say anything to Silas. I went home after Christmas and I sat with the feeling for a long time, and I started, without fully deciding to, keeping the 11 texts open on my phone more often than I probably should have, rereading them, not because I wanted to relive it, but because they were the only proof I had that a version of events existed where I was not just the sister who happened to be there. Vivian, to her credit, was the one person outside my father who ever actually asked me how I was doing after that night, calling me about 6 weeks in to check in, and during that call I finally said some of it out loud for the first time, carefully, the way you test weight on ice. And she listened without trying to fix it or minimize it, which was more than I had gotten from almost anyone else. She told me she had felt sick about the coat check policy ever since, that she had pushed for it originally because her own family gets glued to their phones at every event, and she had wanted one night without it, and that she had no idea, sitting at her own reception, that her sister-in-law was outside doing chest compressions on a gravel lot while everyone else danced. I told her it was not her fault. I meant it. I did not tell her about the growing feeling that it had somehow become nobody's fault at all, which meant it had also become nobody's responsibility to acknowledge what I had actually gone through. The real fracture happened in February, at a small family dinner at Silas and Vivian's new house, when the subject came up again, this time because Silas himself brought it up. trying, I think, to be generous, saying something about how grateful he was that Dad had pulled through and how the whole family had really come together that night. And something in me, some final overworked hinge, simply gave out, quietly, the way a beam gives out, not with a snap but with a slow deflection past the point where it was ever coming back. I said, in a voice that surprised even me with how flat it came out, that I had not experienced that night as the family coming together. I had experienced it as being completely alone on a gravel parking lot for 40 minutes while everyone else was inside dancing to a song I could still name. Silas looked genuinely confused, not defensive yet, just confused, and he said he did not understand what I meant, that he had come as soon as he found out, and I said, yes, 40 minutes after I first texted him, and he said he never got the texts because his phone was in a lockbox, and I said I knew that, I had known that for months, and that was not actually the part that hurt anymore. The part that hurt was that in every single retelling of that night since, by our father, by Odalise, by half the family at 2 different holidays, the story had quietly rearranged itself so that his 40 minutes of not knowing had become the emotional center of the night, and my 40 minutes of knowing everything, alone, with my hands on our father's chest, had disappeared from the account almost entirely. He said I was being unfair, that nobody was trying to erase what I went through, that people just naturally talk about what they personally experienced, and I told him that was exactly the problem, that I had spent 20 years being the family member whose experience got absorbed quietly into the background of everyone else's story. Starting at 11 years old with a mother who died and a father who needed help he could not ask for, and a little brother who needed a version of a parent I was not actually equipped to be, and that I was tired, bone tired, of being the load-bearing wall that nobody remembers to mention when they talk about how the house is still standing. I did not raise my voice. I want that on the record, because in every version of this story that circulated afterward, at least at first, I was the one who made a scene at that dinner, when in fact I had simply, for the first time in my adult life, refused to disappear inside somebody else's narrative of a night that had nearly cost me my father. I did not talk to Silas for the next several weeks, not out of a decision so much as an absence of anything left to say that would not simply repeat what I had already said once, and had already been dismissed once. My father called me during that stretch, sounding tired and confused, asking why I was punishing Silas for a phone policy he could not control, and I told him, as gently as I could manage, that I was not punishing anyone for a phone policy. I was asking to be seen for what I had actually done that night, instead of continuing to be edited out of the story, so everyone could focus on how hard it had been for the groom. My father did not have much to say to that. I do not think it had ever occurred to him, in 4 months of retelling that story to relatives, that I might have needed something from the retelling too. I started seeing a therapist that spring, a woman named Dr. Genevieve Okafor Lindstrom who specialized in family systems and specifically in what she called parentified children, a term I had never heard before, and that landed on me with the force of a diagnosis I did not know I had been waiting my whole life to receive. She explained in our 3rd session that children who are assigned adult responsibilities early, especially after a loss, often grow into adults who are extremely competent in a crisis and almost invisible in its aftermath, because the family has learned to rely on their steadiness without ever learning to ask what that steadiness costs. She said something I wrote down afterward on a sticky note I still keep in my wallet. She said, "You were never the sister who happened to be there. You were the sister who was trained, your whole life, to be the only one who could be there, and then blamed, quietly, for how good you got at it." I brought the 11 texts to one of our sessions, scrolling through them on my phone while Dr. Okafor Lindstrom sat with the same unhurried patience I would come to rely on over the following year, and she asked me what I thought those texts actually represented, beyond the obvious record of that night. I told her I did not know, and she said, "Take your time," and I sat there for a long moment before I said the true thing, which was that they were the only proof I had that I had not imagined how alone I was that night, because everyone else's version of the story had gotten so loud and so complete that I had genuinely started to wonder if my own memory of it was somehow exaggerated, dramatic, unfair to Silas, all the words my father had used on the phone. She told me something that reframed the entire year for me. She said the texts were not evidence for Silas. Silas already knew he had not seen them. That was never actually in dispute. The texts were evidence for me, a fixed, unchangeable record I could return to whenever the family's retelling started to make me doubt my own experience, and that the goal was never necessarily to make Silas feel guilty about something that was not fully his fault. The goal was to make sure that somewhere, in at least one conversation, the full truth of that night got said out loud, once, clearly, without softening it into something more comfortable for everyone else to carry. Over the summer, I made a decision that felt small at the time and turned out to be enormous. I stopped attending the family group chat's daily chatter, not dramatically, just quietly, watching messages accumulate without responding the way I once would have. Always the one who kept the thread alive with a quick reply or a supportive comment. I wanted to see, the way a scientist wants to see, how long it would take for anyone to notice that the person who had spent 2 decades holding the family's daily rhythm together had simply stepped back from it. It took 11 days for my father to text me directly, and when he did, it was to ask if I could pick up his prescription refill because he had a doctor's appointment that conflicted with the pharmacy's hours. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I miss talking to you." A prescription refill. I picked it up, because I am apparently constitutionally incapable of leaving my father without medication he needs, but I did not fold back into the group chat afterward, and I did not call to check in the way I used to, 3 or 4 times a week, just to see how everyone was doing. I wanted a second data point, the way Dr. Okafor Lindstrom had gently encouraged me to think of it, not as revenge but as information, and the information came in slowly and then all at once. Silas did not reach out at all for 6 weeks. Vivian texted twice, both times warm and specific, asking real questions and waiting for real answers, which told me something important about where the actual capacity for connection in that family had always lived, and it was not where I had spent 20 years assuming it was. Around that same time, I did something I am not entirely proud of, though I have made my peace with it since, the way Dr. Okafor Lindstrom helped me understand that peace does not always require pride. I went to a family law and estate attorney, a woman named Marisol Gutenberg who had helped my father update his will after the heart attack, ostensibly just to check in on how the paperwork had gone, but really because I wanted to understand something I had never once asked about in 20 years of being the one who managed everything. I asked her, plainly, how the estate was currently structured, and she told me, with my father's permission since he was a client of record and had already authorized her to speak with me about it, that the house and the bulk of the estate were set to be divided evenly between Silas and me, which surprised me in a way I had not expected, because some small, tired part of me had been braced to learn that even that had quietly tilted toward my brother the way everything else in the family's attention seemed to. I want to be honest about what that piece of information did to me, because it did not resolve anything, and I think it is important to say that clearly. It did not undo the 40 minutes on the gravel. It did not undo Thanksgiving or Christmas or the 2 months of near silence that followed that February dinner. What it did was remind me that fairness and visibility are 2 completely different things, and that a father can genuinely love both his children equally in the ledger of his estate while still, in the daily currency of attention and retelling, spending almost everything he has on one of them, because that is where his instinct has always pulled without him ever noticing it was pulling at all. The actual turning point came in September, almost exactly 11 months after the wedding, when our father had a follow-up echocardiogram that came back showing further decline in function, not dramatic, but real, the kind of number that makes a cardiologist's tone shift slightly, even when her words stay measured. Dr. Vashisht sat the 3 of us down, me, Silas, and our father, in her office, and explained that his heart was not going to recover the ground it had lost, that this was, medically speaking, his new normal, and that going forward the family would need to be more attentive to warning signs, because a second cardiac event on a heart already operating at reduced capacity carried significantly higher risk than the first one had. I watched Silas's face during that appointment, and I watched him do something I had genuinely not expected, which was to ask Dr. Vashisht, in a voice that cracked slightly, whether earlier response time on the night of the wedding could have prevented some of this decline. She was careful and professional in her answer, the way doctors are trained to be, but she did not dodge it either. She said that in cases like this, minutes matter enormously, and that while she could not say with certainty exactly how much difference those particular minutes made, the data on delayed defibrillation intervals generally supported the idea that faster response meaningfully improves long-term cardiac outcomes. Silas sat very still after that. I did not say anything. I did not need to. The doctor had said, in a clinical voice with real credentials behind it, the exact thing I had been carrying alone in my chest for almost a year. We drove home separately that day, but Silas called me that night, later, after 10, in a voice I had not heard from him since he was maybe 12 years old and scared of something he could not name. He asked if we could talk, really talk. Not the kind of talk that happens at a family dinner with everyone else listening and our father's comfort silently governing what gets said and what stays buried. I told him yes. I told him I would come over Sunday. And that is the conversation I started this story with. The one where I finally opened my phone and let 11 messages do what I had never quite managed to do myself in 11 months of trying to say it out loud without my voice breaking. I showed him the first text, sent at 9:19, and I told him what dispatch had walked me through in the 90 seconds before I sent it. I showed him the second, sent at 9:20, and told him what our father's face had looked like by then. I showed him the third, sent at 9:23, 3 words, he's not breathing, and I watched my brother's face go the same grayish color our father's lips had gone that night, because I think that was the exact moment the story stopped being an abstraction he had absorbed secondhand through a year of family retellings and became, finally, a real 40 minutes with real numbers attached to it. I showed him the photo attached to the 9th message, one I had never shown anyone, a picture I had taken without fully deciding to, my hand shaking so badly the image is blurred, of paramedic Purefoy's hands mid-compression against our father's chest on the gravel, because some instinct in me at the time had understood that I needed proof this had actually happened, even as it was happening. He put the phone down on the coffee table between us and did not say anything for a long time, the kind of silence Dr. Okafor Lindstrom had taught me not to rush to fill. And when he finally spoke, he said the thing I had been waiting almost a year to hear, not an apology this time, something more specific and more useful than that. He said, I have spent this whole year telling people what it felt like to find out. I have never once asked what it felt like for you to already know. And I told him, honestly, that it felt like being 11 years old again, standing in a kitchen understanding for the first time that some things simply land on you and nobody comes, and that the difference this time was that I was 31 instead of 11, and I finally had the words and the evidence to say so out loud instead of just quietly absorbing it and calling it love. We talked for almost 3 hours that night, longer than we had talked, really talked, in years, and I told him about Thanksgiving, about the version of the story where I disappeared into the background of his 40 minutes, about Christmas and the cousin and our father's retelling that made me a supporting character in my own worst night. He did not defend any of it. I think that surprised me more than anything else that evening, how little defending he actually did once the full record was in front of him, instead of the softened, second-hand version everyone else had been passing around at dinner tables for a year. He said he was going to talk to our father, not to assign blame, but because he thought Dad needed to hear, from him this time, what the full night had actually cost me, since apparently it had taken his own son almost losing him twice, once on the gravel and once in a cardiologist's office, for him to finally understand it. Our father and I had that conversation 2 weeks later, at his kitchen table, the same table where I had spent 2 decades signing permission slips and packing lunches and doing the quiet, unglamorous labor of holding a grieving family together. I did not bring the phone this time. I did not need to. I told him, plainly, that I loved him and that I did not blame him for the retelling, because I understood grief makes people reach for whichever story feels survivable to tell out loud at a holiday table, but that I needed him to understand, once, clearly, without the softening, what those 40 minutes had actually been. I told him about the compressions, about Dispatcher Okonkwo's voice staying calm in my ear while I stopped believing my own hands were doing anything useful, about the color of his lips, about texting his son into a void I did not yet understand was a void. My father cried at that table quietly, the kind of crying a 62-year-old man does when he is not used to doing it in front of his own daughter, and he said the sentence I had needed for almost a year, not a version of it, the actual sentence. He said, I have spent this whole year proud of how strong you were that night, and it never once occurred to me that being proud of your strength was letting me off the hook for asking what it cost you. That is on me, and I am sorry. It did not undo anything. I want to be honest about that, the way I have tried to be honest about all of it, because this is not a story with a clean bow on it. It did not undo the 40 minutes, and it did not undo the year of feeling erased at 2 separate holiday tables. But it was, finally, the full truth said out loud by the person who mattered most in the room, and after 20 years of being the one who held everyone else's version of events steady, that mattered more than I expected it to. Silas and I are close again now, closer in some ways than we were before any of this happened, because we finally have a shared vocabulary for something we had spent our whole lives avoiding naming directly, which is exactly how much I absorbed quietly on both our behalf since we were children, and exactly how little either of them ever thought to ask what that absorption cost. He calls me now, not because Dad asked him to, and not always about something practical. Sometimes he calls just to ask how I am doing, and then, and this is the part that still catches me off guard every time, he actually waits for the answer. Vivian and I are closer too, in the specific way that happens between 2 women who have both quietly figured out the same family dynamic from different angles and finally get to talk about it out loud instead of managing around it separately.